Hi, my name's Justin Schauf, and I'm the founder and run our engineering team here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video guide, I'm going to be talking about how you can use a shared WSUS database for multiple software update points within your Config Manager environment, why you would want to do that, when to do it, and how to do it. So the first thing I want to cover is looking directly at the Config Manager documentation is this bullet point here around best practices for software updates. One of those best practices that they mention here is to use a shared WSUS database for your software update points. The reason why that is generally recommended is because let's say that you have a client that's scanning against software update point 01 within your Config Manager environment. It's going to scan against that WSUS database to determine what updates are actually needed. Now, in the scenario that that server were to go offline, if that client were to fell over to, let's say, SUP 02, if it was using the same WSUS database as SUP 01, it's going to drastically reduce the amount of scan data that that client needs to perform when it falls over to that new SUP. Now, in addition to improved client scanning in the scenario that a client fell over to another software update point using the same shared database, whenever you actually perform a synchronization, it's also going to be faster as well because you're not maintaining multiple databases for your WSUS environment. So if you did have multiple and they were both pointing to their own local SQL database, it would actually have to go and replicate the data from all the SUPs when it syncs down. If you're using a single database, when you perform a sync, you essentially only update one WSUS database. So your syncs will also be faster if you were to switch to use one. Now, there is one scenario where I can think that it probably would not make sense to share your own WSUS database. Let's say that you have a remote location and the connectivity is very slow between that remote software update point and let's say that top level software update point within your primary location. In that scenario, I don't think it would make sense to have the shared database because when that remote SUP does its scanning, it would essentially be going over that slow network to hit that shared SQL database for any type of client scanning going over IIS. So that's really the only scenario I think that you probably wouldn't want to use a shared database. But if you're well connected between all your software update points, I think it could really make sense to switch over to a shared WSUS database to get some of those benefits that I mentioned here. So with that said, we do actually have an environment. So this is actually a site that we recently did our high availability video on. So we actually have some multiple SUPs already kind of ready to go here. So this is going to be make a lot of sense here. So the first thing that we have going on is our primary software update point. So that's kind of the top level. That's the initial SUP that we had configured. And then what I did is we went ahead and added a secondary software update point. And we just kind of used the default options. We didn't go and configure a shared database. So if we actually look here at the SUP 02, we can of course see we have our SUP on there. Same thing with SUP 01. Now the key difference here is that if we go ahead and look at SUP 01 and we open up the registry, we can go ahead and look at the software, Microsoft, update services, server, and then setup key. So this is going to be where WSUS gets installed. We can, of course, see that if we look at our SQL database name, we can see that WSUS is in fact using a SQL database. So it's connecting and using that for the WSUS database. Now, if we take a look at the second SUP, so we'll go ahead and open that one up. And if we look at that same value, we can see that it's actually using a Windows internal database. So we're actually not even running on SQL. We're just using the local Windows internal database instance on this second SUP within our environment. So what we're going to talk about here is the first scenario is going to be you have a remote SUP. It's using either a different SQL database or even the Windows internal database, and you want to switch that second SUP to use the primary database within the top level SUP in your environment. All right, so switching back to our site server, I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick look at what actually happens from the config manager perspective when you have multiple software update points that are not configured to share the same database. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually enable some debug logging. So we're going to go pretty deep in this video and kind of explain how your SUPs get configured, how you can actually see what's going on within the synchronizations when you have multiple SUPs. So within HQ Local Machine Software Microsoft SMS, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the tracing key under the SMS key. And we're going to go ahead and go over to the WSync Manager. And we're going to go ahead and enable the debug logging. So I can see that I've already enabled it to 1. We also enabled the logging level to 0, which would be setting it to verbose logging. And we're going to do the same thing for the WSUS Configuration Manager. So I set it to debug, and then I went ahead and set the log level to 0. Now this is of course optional. I'm just going to enable this so we can get a little bit more details in the log file when we actually see what's going to happen when we start sharing this database and going through the setup. All right, so next what we're going to do is go under our same SMS key, but we're going to take a look at the components. So under the components key, we're going to look at the SMS executive service. And then within that, there's going to be a subkey called thread. So these are going to be all the different components or threads running under the SMS executive service. So you can also do this in your console. So there's a place in your console called under monitoring, you can go here and look at the component status, and you can actually start this resource manager. Now this just generally is a lot slower to load up and do things. It just takes longer. So what we can do directly in this reg key is we can look at the different components or threads running under executive, and we can say, hey, I want to go ahead and stop that component. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the stop action here. So we're going to stop the sync manager because we wouldn't want any synchronizations taking place while we're switching that secondary SUP to be shared DB. We're also going to stop the WSUS configuration manager. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at our site server logs and look at that WCM logs, that's that WSUS configuration manager component. So when we set that requested action to be stop, we can see that shut down that specific thread. So everything else will still be running, but that one thread of the executive service won't be. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and start that back up. And I want to show you how the software update points get listed here in debug mode. So the thing that I really want to show you is we can see our SUP01, right? So here's the primary SUP01. But more importantly, within this WCM component, that's where we can see where the actual database is configured for that software update point within our environment. So we can see this one is, of course, pointing to that database SQL server. But if we look at that secondary SUP, we can see that it's set to use that Windows internal database. So what that means is that config manager is going to essentially say, whenever I do a software update point sync, since these are not shared using the same database, we actually have to loop through each of these SUPs and perform a synchronization of any changed updates whenever we sync. So what I'm going to do now to kind of show what that looks like, we're going to go ahead and start back the component for the sync manager. Then within my SUP or my console, I'm going to go ahead and say we want to run a synchronization. And then we'll go ahead and open that WSync manager log, and I'll wait for this to kick in here. Okay, so it's still kind of running in here, but what we can see is that it did find both of those SUPs. So it's detecting we have two different software update points, and we need to synchronize both of those. All right, so I gave that about 3-4 minutes and our synchronization completed. But what I want to show you here is that since we were using separate databases for both software update points, what we'll notice is that initially, when we perform our synchronization, we can see that it's set to synchronize the initial software update point, which is SUP-1. So we can see that it goes through, it configures the synchronization with the initial SUP, but then what we notice is that it's going to say that it needs to synchronize the replica SUP. So here we go. So here's where it says we're synchronizing the replica. Since they're using two separate databases, we're going to have to essentially replicate any changes from the initial sync that went from the Windows Update catalog to our top level WSUS or software update point to any of those replicas that aren't using the same database. So one benefit by kind of using that shared option is that your synchronizations are going to be much faster because you're only kind of managing that single database source for any of those changes. And then, it went through and then synchronized that replica. So that's kind of what I wanted to show here initially before we actually make the change. Okay. So at this point, we validated the sync is done, so we don't have anything pending. So what I'm going to do is go back to that, and we're going to go ahead and stop our WSync manager thread within our site server, and we're going to go ahead and stop that WSUS configuration manager thread. By doing that, that's just going to ensure that we're not going to try to do any type of replica syncs or anything that goes on during this process when we're actually switching that secondary software update point to use that new shared database. So let me jump over to our secondary SUP. So this is the one that we can see is currently configured to use the Windows internal database. So if you actually want to know where that database lives, within the C drive, under Windows, there's going to be a WID folder. So this is going to be pretty much that Windows internal database that wouldn't even be running on SQL Server. But within here under the data folder, this is going to be where the actual WSUS database lives that's running locally within this Windows internal database instance. So that of course is going to be what we basically switch over. So once we change that over, we don't really care about this database. It will just be kind of left here, and you could even delete that once you verify everything's working. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and open up a command prompt as admin and then launch PowerShell. So this is going to be a little bit different since we are using the Windows internal database instance within this server. What we need to do is actually remove the Windows internal instance because we want to use the SQL instance. Now to do that, there's a command line that we can use to only remove the specific Windows internal instance of the WSUS server. Okay, so there we go. So I think let me do UpdateServices*. I think that's actually what I wanted. So here we go. We can see that since this was initially configured when we installed WSUS to use WID, we actually wouldn't be able to convert this into a shared database on a SQL server until we actually remove the WID component of WSUS and install the SQL component. Now, if you're already running on a local SQL instance, you wouldn't have to perform this configuration to remove the WID instance within WSUS. But since I've noticed a lot of remote SUPs when I was going on site with customers, a lot of times they would have just used the default WID when they configured that. So I thought that would be a good option to kind of cover all the different scenarios here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and paste in a command. So this is going to be removing the Windows internal database instance within the server. So if we look here, we're just going to say Remove-WindowsFeature-name Windows Update-WidDB. So that's going to be the role service within WSUS that would allow WSUS to use a WID database. So if we go ahead and run that command again to show the Windows Update feature, we can now see that WID connectivity is completely gone. So at this point, you really wouldn't be able to connect to your WSUS console, and clients wouldn't be able to scan at this specific moment. Now, before we actually want to configure WSUS to point to that remote SQL server that's also being used on SUP 01, we need to install the actual database connectivity service within WSUS. So that role service is going to be UpdateServices-DB. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and that will install that service for me. There we go. So if we do a quick refresh, we can now see that we are running the WSUS service and we have SQL Server connectivity within there as well. All right, so at this point, we're ready to kind of switch this WSUS instance to use that remote SQL Server that's being used on SUP 01 as well. But what we also need to do is we need this SUP 2 to share the same content folder as SUP 1. So I went ahead and switched back to my primary SUP that is kind of that top level software update point within Config Manager. And we can of course see if we look at our content folder, let's take a look here, we can see that this is just pointing to a local drive on that SUP 01 server. So what we want to do is make sure that we share this folder out because we want to ensure that SUP 02 can also have access to the content because that contains all the EULAs for any updates that require EULAs. So if we're not pointing to that same path, what's going to happen is clients may fail to scan against updates where you need to accept the EULA within the Config Manager console. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my WSUS folder. So we can see within here, we of course have our WSUS content and update service packs like you would be accustomed to. So back on that root level, I'm going to go ahead and choose Properties, and we're going to go ahead and share out this folder. Oh, let's do Advanced Sharing. I'm going to share it out, and I'm just going to name it WSUS here. Within the permissions, we're going to go ahead and give everybody full control, and we'll lock this down using NTFS permission. So we'll go ahead and do OK on that, and then close, and that looks good. But actually within the security tab, what we need to ensure is that the computer account of the secondary software update point has permissions to read into this directory, because it's going to be connecting here whenever clients need to do the EULA scans where they actually require it to validate the file. So from here, we're going to go ahead and look at the permissions, and I'm going to go ahead and add the computer object of that secondary SUP that we're going to be sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and just type that in. Okay. And we'll just add that computer account. And we need to have full control should be fine. Technically, you could probably get away with just modify with there, but I'm going to go ahead and give it full control so that we can make any changes within that secondary SUP for that configuration. All right, so that's looks like that's applied now, so we should be good there. We'll go ahead and do close here and then close here. All right, so let's go back to our SUP2. And what we want to do is we want to navigate to our WSUS installation folder. So we're going to go ahead and go to Program Files. Let's do Program Files, Update Services, Tools. Oh, let's see, that's CD. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to a command line rather than PowerShell for this operation. So what we want to run next is within the Tools folder of the WSUS services, there's a WSUS util tool. So this is where we can come in and change different configurations within WSUS. So we take a quick look back at where we were at and do a refresh. We can see that we've switched things over to allow SQL connectivity, but of course we haven't told it where to look. So it's still saying, hey, we're pointing at that local WID database. So that's of course not what we want here. So what we're going to do is run a WSUS util command to switch everything over. So let me go ahead and paste this in and kind of show you what we're doing here. So we're running WSUS util. We're going to run the post install command. So that's going to allow us to set the SQL Server and content folder that we need to use for that post action where we want to configure it. So what we can see, we're running SQL_instance_name equals, and then the database server. So we can see that we're just pointing to our SQL Server where the WSUS database exists for SUP01. So we're going to point it to that same exact SQL Server. Now, if you're using a custom instance, you could just put a backslash after the server name and then your instance name. And then next, we want to set the content dir. So there's just a content_dir parameter equals, and then we want the full path for our WSUS share. Now, actually, I don't want to include the WSUS content. I made that wrong. We want to go to the root of that share path. So just to validate that looks good, let me go ahead and copy that path. And then we'll paste that in. So let's just go to the root of WSUS. And we can, of course, see the share path that's going to be the WSUS content and update service packs will be within this root folder that we're pointing at. So that looks good. All right, now before we run this, I'm going to go ahead and open up CM Trace just so we can view the log file. So we'll go ahead and get that opened up. And we will go ahead and kick off this post-install WSUS util configuration. Now we can see it's writing out to a log file in the temp location, so I'm going to copy that path, and I'm going to go ahead and open up that log within CM Trace. Now it might take a second for it to start writing out the log. All right, so we can see that it's currently running the configuration. We've got some log files. So for example, you can see where the content directory is getting moved to. You can see whether the SQL instance is going to get set to. And we'll go ahead and just kind of monitor this. It shouldn't take more than probably about 30 seconds or less from what I've seen in the past here. All right, there we go. Looks like the post install completed successfully. We can also validate in the log file that it completed. So if we come back to our registry here and do a refresh of this key, we can now see that our content directory is pointed to that remote UNC on the primary SUP01, and we can see that our database server is using that same shared database server that SUP01's WSUS SUS-DB is located on. So it looks like the post install is good. At this point, we're pretty much using the same exact database for any operations for scanning within this secondary SUP. So this looks pretty good. Now, there are some common actions that can not get configured correctly after this post install. So the first thing that we've noticed is that if you open up IIS, and we'll go ahead and open up that WSUS administration website, within the content folder, it seems that when you use a UNC path, it does not correctly configure the path to point to the remote UNC share. So if we come in here and look at our basic settings up here, we can see that it put in the path, but when it does that move command, it doesn't detect that it's actually a UNC path. So you can see it's pointing to an invalid path without the //. So first thing we want to do is go ahead and fix that if you detect that it had that within your scenario. So we'll go ahead and choose to run that, and we'll test the connection, and we can validate that, it does see that there is a share there, but the first thing that you notice here is that it says it can't validate that the IIS service has permissions to it. So first thing, we'll save that initially. So that looks good. Now, what we want to do is kind of run a test to see if we can actually browse out to that content folder for a file that actually lives there. So I'm going to go ahead and click Browse, and that's going to take us to the root level of the content folder here. All right, so the first thing that you're going to notice, this is completely expected that you're going to get a forbidden message if you browse out directly to the root of the content. So that's expected. That's not going to allow you to browse directly at the root level. So that's okay that we're seeing this error message. But if we go ahead and look out at that WSUS content folder, there is always a test text file that you can use to see whether you have permissions to actually browse out from your software update point in IIS to actually view whether it can load that file. So of course, if we go ahead and paste that in, we can see that we're detecting that IIS does not have permissions to actually validate that we can open that text file. So what that means, that would also cause issues with all these different content folders within this folder. So this is going to be where EULAs get stored. So each EULA that you have to accept will have a text file that lets you know you accepted it. So if you're unable to browse out to this file for this basic text file to test it, that means that clients would eventually get scan issues if you had any updates in here that required you to accept the EULA within the Config Manager console. So first of all, we need to fix this issue where IIS cannot connect. The reason that it's having issues connecting is of course because rather than using just a local path where we would have access to look at it, we're using this remote UNC path for that WSUS content folder. So by default, if we look in IIS and we look at the content, if we right click and choose the we actually want to go to authentication. So if we click on the authentication within the content folder, what we want to look at is the anonymous access for authentication. So anonymous authentication, if you right click and click edit, you can see that by default, the IIS service is trying to use a local service account only known to this local machine. Since the content is hosted on that remote SUP01, of course, this local user that's kind of running this identity is not going to be known or have any type of permission. So what we want to do, we want to run this under the application pool identity. So that's going to be essentially using the system account. And since we gave the system account access to that shared folder for SUP02, that computer account, that should allow the authentication to take place when we switch that to use that type of identity for the authentication. So that should be set. So what we want to do, we want to come back into Internet Explorer and do a refresh. And now what we can see is that file did in fact load. Now this is of course just an empty file, but we can see that we're not getting any type of permission errors. So this looks good. That means that clients would be able to validate the EULAs whenever they're scanning against this SUP02 WSUS configuration. So that looks good from this shared database. We should be good to go. Lastly, what we can do is just open the WSUS console, and we're just validate, of course, that it loads and you can connect and see a few different things here. So it looks like we do have it loaded. We've got a couple updates, but they're just not showing up because the current filter that we have configured here, but this looks good. There we go. So that looks good. Okay, so let's go back to our primary site server. So next we'll go ahead and start the WSUS configuration manager. So this was what we had in that stop state. So we're going to go ahead and let me just refresh this to verify it's still stopped. Let's take a look. All right, looks like it might have restarted itself. Let's take a look here. There we go. So yeah, it looks like even though we did have it stop for a second, I expect that the executive service detected, hey, this component is no longer running, and then it went ahead and restarted it. So what I wanted to show you back in this WCM log, let's see if we can figure out when it actually got restarted. So there's where we stopped it. Okay, so here we go. We can see it started up about 3 minutes ago, it looks like. So then it went through the normal startup where it's going to connect to all the software update points. So we can see it connecting to SUP01. But what we can see here is that when it connected to SUP02, if we take a look, we can see that that component detected, hey, this server is now different. WSUS is no longer using that WID database, but it's also now using the same database server that SUP01 is using. So if we look at that, we can see that it of course is showing up with that same configuration here. So that looks pretty good. Just to show you that they're exactly the same, we'll go ahead and do a requested operation. We'll go ahead and stop it once more, and then we'll go ahead and start it back up. And then we'll open up that same log file. And now what you can see is that when it's loading the list, we can see that the SUP01 and SUP02 are now using that same database configuration. So this is how SCCM is going to know, hey, these are the same exact backends for the database, so we don't need to do any type of replica syncing. We're going to treat these like a single software update point. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now, what I want to do is, since we just synchronized from Windows Update, there's not going to be any type of catalog changes if we go ahead and sync again. So what I'm going to do is go back to my primary SUP, my SUP01, and what I'm going to do is just go ahead and run our kind of local Patch My PC service that we use for third-party patches, and I'm going to go ahead and run a synchronization. So since I have Google Chrome currently enabled for publishing, I just know that a new Chrome update just got released today, the 7th of February. So what's going to happen is we're going to go ahead and download and publish the new update for Chrome. So while we wait for that to complete, once that's done, we'll go ahead and run one more synchronization within our actual software update point, just so we can see the new sync happening, and we can see how these SUPs are now treated as a single software update point within the sync status. All right, so we can see those two new Chrome updates just published. So let's go back to our console and let's go ahead and run a synchronization so we can pull in those newly published updates. So we'll look back at that WSync Manager log, kind of zoom in there and wait for that to kick in here. There we go, so starting the sync. There we go, so we can see the new Google Chrome updates coming in. And now what we can see is that we didn't get any notification that we need to sync any replicas. So of course, this is just going to treat the sync as if it was just a single software update point, since both of these are pointing to that same database. So that looks good. So if we come back in here, we can see that the sync looks good, of course. If we look at our software update point synchronization status, we can see that they both just completed, and that looks good. So there we go, last updated. So that's how we would move an existing SUP that was configured using WID or even SQL Server on that local SUP to use the same database as the top level software update point within your site. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove the SUP from my SUP02. And what we're going to do is basically show you how you would configure this if it was a clean installation of a server where you would have to go through the initial WSUS installation rather than converting an existing SUP that was already out there. So I'll go ahead and get that configured and we'll pause it while that happens. All right, so just remove the WSUS role. So we'll go ahead and restart and get this back to a state where WSUS is not installed on SUP2. All right, so we are back and now we're logged back into SUP-2. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and reinstall the WSUS role now that we cleanly uninstalled it. So this would be a scenario where if you wanted to stand up a second SUP from scratch and you wanted to make sure that it uses that same shared WSUS database during the initial configuration, this is what that would look like. So we're of course just going to go through the default kind of wizard here. You could of course use Powershell if you wanted. Now, one thing I did not mention, I think in the first scenario, is you do need to make sure that the two different software update points, or really any number of software update points that is using the same WSUS shared database, are running the same OS version. So you wouldn't want a server running server 2016 version of WSUS to connect and share the database with running 2019, for example. You need to make sure that the WSUS version for the operating system, as well as if you've done any type of custom patches, are at the same level when you use a shared WSUS database. In my case, we're of course both running 2016, so we should be perfectly fine here. So within the WSUS configuration, we need to ensure that we uncheck WID. So this is kind of that default one where you could, accidentally use that, and that could be an option where you want to switch from WID to that shared DB, or even go from WID to maybe a local SQL on the actual SUP itself. And we do have a guide if you do want to convert from WID to SQL. We have a separate guide for that as well. There we go. So SQL connectivity. Now for the option where we want to store updates, this is going to be where we point out to that same UNC path. Now I'm not going to worry about recreating that for this demo. We of course already did that in the initial scenario where we converted the previous SUP to use the shared database. So we should already have it shared. We should have all the permissions configured and ready to go here. And then next, we're going to go ahead and enter our SQL database name. So we're going to, of course, point to that remote SQL server that's running the shared SUP. We'll do next here, and then we'll go ahead and install. Now, this is also, if we look at CM trace, here we go. If we go ahead and open the temp directory, we should have the log file is going to be created in this .temp file. So once that kicks in, we'll see the configuration happening here. So there we go. So the initial install is done, but of course we have to run this post-install task. So we'll go ahead and run that. And this is actually where we should see the log file. Let's go ahead and see if we have a new one that got created here. There we go. All right, so we can see the post-install completed successfully. We can, of course, see all the actions that took place within the install. So it's going to be quite similar. At the end of the day, this is really just running the same post-install configuration. We're just doing it from the initial setup wizard because WSUS wasn't previously installed. So, of course, if we open up regedit, so regedit, there, if I could type, there we go. So if we do a refresh here, we're going to see it looks pretty much exactly the same as the SUP that we kind of converted that was initially installed. So we've got our UNC path for the content, and we're using our remote SQL server for our connectivity here. So this looks good. Now, if we go ahead and copy that anonymous file path and go ahead and test that, it's probably pretty likely that the same configuration issues may still be in place. So we can see that it looks like it's not able to detect it. We're getting a 404 not found. So if we look here, we can of course see, hey, when it ran that configuration for whatever reason for that post-install bug, it did not put the // for our UNC path. So we'll go ahead and open up IIS. There we go. And we'll go ahead and look at our content folder under our WSUS administration, and we'll choose to edit the basic settings over here on the right, and we'll go ahead and put in that // like we did before, and that looks good. Now, of course, if we refresh the page now, we're probably going to get the unauthorized because we're running under that special account that remote software update point for SUP01 will know nothing about and would not be able to authenticate it. So we're going to come back in under authentication. We're going to right click Anonymous and choose edit. And then rather than using that user account that's done by default, we want to use the application pool identity. We'll go ahead and set that, go ahead and refresh. And at this point, we now have authentication so we can access the EULA files and any third-party updates that have been published when you download them into your deployment package within SCCM. So this looks good. Now, come back to our site server. Of course, all we would do here is come back, add a new site system role. We're going to go ahead and choose our software update point. We'll do OK. We're running on the non-default port, so that's going to be 8530 by default on server 2012, 2016, and 2019. And we'll do next here. We don't have SSL currently configured, and we'll leave the default options here. Now, when this operation completes, so we'll do next here, it's going to use that same WCM component, of course. So if we look at that, that's going to be the component that configures any new software update point. So we'll see that kick in a second. There we go. So we can see it started connecting to the SUP2 here, and it's starting to configure that as well. So there we go. It's starting that. While we're waiting for that to complete, we should also see if we open the site comp or the site component manager log on the site server, you'll also see some information about where it's installing the software update point. There's a few binaries that get copied and registered on that remote SUP as well. And you can see all of that taking place within the site comp log within the site server as well. So we can see the different DLLs and files that get copied when we actually configure the software update point role to install. All right, so we can see the configuration is now done in wcm.log. It looks good. And just for a quick test, we could, of course, go ahead and run a software update point synchronization to get that validated and make sure that the syncs are happening okay. Now, of course, from a multiple software update point perspective, you will want to make sure that you have the new site system in the boundaries that you may have configured within your site. So for example, if both of these SUPs were kind of in a similar area and you just wanted to include them both within a single boundary group. So in my case, I kind of have a lab. I have a boundary group here. What we could do is you would just want to make sure that under the references for your boundary group that both of the site systems are here. So that would just ensure that your clients kind of split across the two different software update points evenly. So just keep that in mind. You might want to make sure that your SUPs are kind of in the same group or have them defined in a way where one SUP is local to your kind of clients that are close to that boundary group, for example. All right, so we can see that the synchronization completed fine, and we now have our two SUPs using the same WSUS database. I hope this video was helpful, and like always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment in the video below or the accompanying blog post.